Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Balkan Devlen. I'm the Director of Transatlantic Program and a Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I am today joined in this Inside Policy Talks with Professor Alexander Lanoszka, who is an assistant professor and soon to be an associate professor at University of Waterloo, and a senior fellow here at MLI. Alexander, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let me just jump into the topic of the day. We are about a month or 3 weeks out from the NATO summit in Vilnius in Lithuania, and there are a lot of expectations when it comes to that particular summit. There are talks about Ukraine's potential membership, security commitments. There are expectations when it comes to strengthening the enhanced forward presence in the region, and what the expectations are of the host nations, as well as what are expectations from the framework nations. And Canada has been announcing a number of initiatives. Most recently, the announcement that we will be sending about 15 Leopard 2 tanks and the necessary personnel and troops to go along with it to strengthen our presence in EFB. So there's a lot to talk about on that particular domain. So I just want to start with, for the audience, just a quick refresher when it comes to Canada's commitment in Latvia and enhanced forward presence. Could you give us like a 3-4 minute overview of the history of our involvement there, and how we started, where are we right now, before getting into the nitty-gritty, the weeds of the current policies and the future of the EFB and Canadian commitments to NATO?
Sure. So the story begins in part in 2014, but we should really go further back to when the Baltic countries joined NATO. As per the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, there was a commitment on the part of the alliance not to commit substantial numbers of combat forces to those countries that joined the alliance in the post-Cold War environment, in view of the security environment that was seen to be one where there would be less of a need for such forces to be positioned eastwards. And as such, the alliance itself did not really have any sort of defense plans for the security of the Baltic countries until sometime in the Obama administration, when the Lithuanian president at the time, Grybauskaitė, had asked for such plans to be drafted and indeed implemented. In 2014, of course, there was nothing really in the Baltic region as far as NATO's own military commitments were concerned. It was just the promise of political and military support in the event of Russian military aggression. But with, of course, the illegal annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of the Donbas region in 2014, this lack of presence in NATO's newer easternmost members became a problem, in part because there was uncertainty as to the future direction of Russian military aggression. And so at the Wales summit that year, there was some effort made to have a very high readiness joint task force being put in place that would help reassure the Baltic countries, being small as they are, in addition to Poland. But there was still a lot of uncertainty about what exactly the VJTF would be, considering its multinational character and its own placement on NATO territory and so forth. And so at the 2016 Warsaw Summit, NATO countries agreed to the formation of the Enhanced Forward Presence, which envisioned multinational battalion-sized battle groups to be placed in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, with framework nations, Great Britain, Canada, Germany, and the United States, respectively, providing the military backbone to those battle groups. And so between 2017 and 2021, these battle groups typically had about 1,000 military personnel, give or take a few hundred. Again, this is with respect to the agreements made at the Warsaw Summit. Canada arrived in 2017 in January. It's not entirely clear what sort of capabilities it would have at its disposal then. Indeed, there was some uncertainty. But there's, again, from the Canadian perspective, was part of a larger initiative called Operation Reassurance, which is still in place, designed to firm up Canada's commitment to NATO, in particular, its more vulnerable neighbors like Latvia and those in the Eastern flank. So there has been Canadian contributions at sea, with Halifax class frigates being deployed to NATO waters in Europe, in addition to Canada's participation in the Baltic Air Policing Mission, as well as in the NATO presence located in Romania. But of course, the land presence, the commitment to Latvia, is the signature element of Operation Reassurance. That is indeed part of enhanced forward presence, and it is a multinational battalion-sized battle group that now comprises 11 countries, effectively, with Canada and Latvia, of course, included in that number. It's by far the most diverse battle group. It's also the largest, in part because of that diversity. And there's some interesting story as to why Canada got that particular battle group. But I've spoken too long, so I think that's more or less the gist of Canada's own history as regards to the Latvia deployment.
Awesome. I think this is very good, and I think it provides just a quick refresher for people watching or listening this episode. But two quick questions. So since our involvement in Latvia with this battle groups, battalion-sized battle groups, there was also a decision later last year taken in Madrid summit to upgrade them to a brigade level. Could you sort of unpack that a little bit? What it means, what kind of requirements or improvements that suggests, and what is the status of that? Since the decision or a communique was taken or announced in Madrid in NATO summit last year. What is the significance of that development? What that implies for not only for Canada but for other allies when it comes to NS forward presence?
To be sure, the Madrid decision did not come out of nowhere. So towards the end of 2021, when the implications of Russia's military buildup near Ukraine became fairly clear, the framework nations like the United States, Great Britain, and Germany, and eventually Canada for that matter, would reinforce the battalion-sized battle groups positioned in their host countries respectively. And so there was already some effort made to upscale, as it were, those battle groups. But with the launch of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, that gave new impetus for even more upscaling of those battle groups. And indeed, NATO formed new battle groups in the Czech Republic, Slovakia,
Romania.
as well as Romania, Hungary, and even Bulgaria, which is something that is certainly unthinkable prior to 2022. And so the Madrid summit sought to not only consolidate these reinforcements, but to certify the commitment on the part of NATO members to further upgrade those battle groups from battalion size to brigade size. And as per NATO standards, a brigade is about 4,000 to 5,000 troops. In Canada, we have 3 brigades. They're about 4,700 military personnel, give and take. And so to go from 1,200, which was typical for the Canadian-led deployment in Latvia, to about 1,800, which was the case in November 2020. So on the eve of Russia's decision to build up militarily near Ukraine, to 2,000, as it were, around the time of the invasion to 4,000 or perhaps even 5,000, obviously is going to be very demanding on any particular framework nation or contributing countries. And I mentioned that there were 9 or 10 contributing countries. They vary in terms of what they give, and some of them kind of slip in and out. But still, it's a lot of capabilities that these countries have to provide. And so there are certain questions being asked as to how possible it is for Canada or for any of those contributing countries to provide the necessary units to flesh out a brigade-sized battle group.
What percentage of that roughly 2,000 troops right now is Canadian Canadian troops?
By my reckoning, there are about 700 Canadian military personnel located in Latvia.
Oh.
And indeed, Defense Minister Anand had mentioned that in addition to the 15 Leopard tanks, there'll be 130 more military personnel that'll be deployed as part of that commitment.
So about 80% then of that, roughly 2,000, 85% are Canadian troops located.
Yeah, so this is in distinction from what we see, for example, in Britain, in the British-led battle group in Estonia, or the US-led battle group in Poland, whereby the framework nation provides a large majority of forces to the battle group. In both Latvia and Lithuania, the framework nations of Canada and Germany are working with a fairly large number of contributing countries. And so they provide a little less than what the British or the Americans are providing to Estonia and Poland, respectively.
Okay. I mean, this also makes you wrote an excellent article for Inside Policy last year, talking about the mission as the unsung song success story of Canada's deployment abroad, and this makes it Canada's largest military commitment, and not only sort of military, but also including the political missions abroad. This makes it the largest commitment Canada currently has abroad, which again I think is an important point to sort of underline for the audience to understand the size of it and the importance that Canada attaches to this particular mission. So I just wanted to highlight that one. So going back to the challenges that you have identified, going from 2,000 to 4,000 or 5,000, where would those troops come from?
I'm not too familiar with the Canadian order of battle to say, but we do know that in 2017, Strong, Secure, Engage envisioned a force structure of about 71,500 troops, and we're about 12,000 short of that goal, from what I understand, in part because of basic recruitment problems. The economy is doing very well right now. It's hard to entice young people to join the Canadian Armed Forces, as well as retention issues owing to perceptions of a very toxic environment, not the least of which has been fueled by a number of sexual harassment scandals that have rocked the Canadian military at the very highest levels. And so, without going into necessarily the equipment issues, the armament issues, the procurement issues, and so forth, the Canadian Armed Forces already have difficulty trying to fill the ranks. And of course, if we're trying to provide the backbone of a 4,000 or 5,000 strong battle group with our own forces, that's going to be really challenging, in part because we have trouble already meeting our own recruitment targets, to say nothing of retention targets and so forth.
So other allies who are part of this mission will probably also need to step up to provide, maybe increase the number of troops that they're providing. There was a recent deployment or announcement of deployment of Danish troops, about 800 or so, I think, going up to 1,000 to Latvia as a part of the multinational group North, I believe. What's the relationship with that and EFP?
That deployment was interesting because it in fact highlighted some gaps and equipment that the Canadian Armed Forces have. And indeed, some Canadian Armed Forces personnel in Latvia have sought to acquire their own equipment, vests and so forth,
Yeah.
gear,
So that one.
on the private market, or they would in fact borrow them from those Danish soldiers for the sake of going about training exercises. So obviously, the Danish contribution is very important. It helps shore up the battle group. It helps flesh it out, uh, but has had this unfortunate, but perhaps necessary effect of exposing some gaps that the Canadian Armed Forces do experience. And those are gaps that unfortunately are very real in the Latvian context.
Do you expect, I mean, this gap that you have identified and the need to actually invest in those capabilities and to properly equip the Canadian troops uh, to fulfill the commitments that Canada made would require increased investment. Do you expect to see uh, specific budget items or amounts announced whenever the defense policy update comes? And if you do, what direction do you think that should go to ensure that we are actually fulfilling the commitments that we make back in Madrid and continue to provide our soldiers with the basic kit that they don't need to go and buy on the market
On Amazon.
on
Yeah.
Amazon?
Amazon's not really available in Latvia, but still. Yeah, so I would hope that those news reports that identify these glaring needs will galvanize the Canadian government to acquire those gear or those pieces of equipment so as to avoid relying on Danish soldiers or on the private marketplace to fill them. There have been, of course, statements made by the defense minister that certain pieces of military equipment or hardware sent to Ukraine, for instance, would be replenished or would be filled. This was in reference to the provision of Leopard 2A tanks to Ukraine that Canada will seek new tanks, not necessarily Leopard 2 tanks, but nevertheless main battle tanks all the same. And indeed, the Canadian defense budget has been steadily growing since 2015, 2016, especially since Trump won the presidency, to everyone's surprise, in May of 2016. And so the news is not entirely terrible as far as spending is concerned, because we are seeing that uptick. And our colleague Richard Shimuka has written this wonderful piece for the Hub showing that there are a number of spending initiatives that are aimed at recapitalizing parts of the Canadian Armed Forces, including looking into advanced artillery systems, new drone capabilities, to say nothing of trying to replace our aging submarine fleet, as well as the efforts currently underway to acquire British-made Type 26 frigates to again replace our aging frigate fleet. So there are certainly efforts underway. Whether it's enough, that's, I think, a question that many military analysts will answer in the negative, precisely because Canada is a rich country. It does spend 1.5% of its GDP, sure, but it's a large economy all the same. That does mean quite a bit of hardware all the same. But we do train a lot. We do engage in these sorts of operations like reassurance or the enhanced forward presence as part of reassurance, which does mean we have a lot of training undertaken at a high operational tempo. But that also means that we do go through gear and component parts rather quickly, perhaps more quickly than some of our allies who do not engage in as much training. So there are efforts being made to address these gaps, but precisely because the Canadian Armed Forces have suffered from not just years, but decades of neglect, there's a lot of overhang, and we're only starting to address those gaps in rather piecemeal fashion, but in a way that's still trending in a positive direction.
Oh, that's good to hear. I mean, two quick questions before moving to the sort of the bigger picture in Vilnius and what we can expect over there. One, with the announcement of the 15 Leopard tanks being sent alongside the personnel related to it, do you think that is the capability gap that needs to be filled, or what other sort of, when you look at the broad EFP in terms of the requirements to strengthen and ensure that those troops are protected and that they do provide defense rather than a tripwire, which the shift from to the actual defense rather than acting them as a tripwire, is that the capability that is needed, or do we need to sort of focus on and remedy other capability gaps, such as, for example, short range air defense systems and others?
Yeah, so you touch on this classic debate that surrounds the FP as to whether these forces constitute simply a tripwire or are a combat credible force on their own right. I don't think they're quite a tripwire. A tripwire would be a token military force incapable of putting much resistance. Some observers would embrace the tripwire label for describing the FP in general because of the military symmetries involved in the region. But in Canada, the official line is that these are absolutely not tripwires. And indeed, the Canadian-led battle group does undertake a very rigorous certification process lasting about 6 months. It's perhaps the most rigorous such process, even though the battle group itself is very multinational, pulling together units from 9 to 11 countries. And as such, they are training to fight, they are training to kill. And as such, they have a lot more combat credibility than what the tripwire moniker would have you believe.
And I think it's also quite important to to highlight the fact that after the reinvasion in February 2022, it became quite clear that just the tripwire component would not cut. It has to be a proper equipped defense force to defend the allies and engage in deterrence by denial, rather than try to act as just a tripwire in which follow-on forces will do the actual work, because the way that Russian army continue to commit war crimes in Ukraine, we saw that the EFP and the troops there have to be proper defense rather than just a tripwire.
But that in turn raises an interesting observation because the combat armed army group positioned or headquartered in Kaliningrad has been effectively destroyed. The Russian military units based in and around Pskov, which would be used in any sort of military contingency against the Baltic countries, have suffered very high attrition. You can even argue that they've been destroyed. And yes, they may be filled out with mobilized military personnel, conscripts, in other words, but we have seen already in Ukraine that these conscripts suffer from low morale. They've undertaken very, very basic training. In fact, there are anecdotes to suggest that they do not even fire more than 10 live rounds of ammunition. And as such, they have been very ill prepared to defend certain points along the front line, and indeed have suffered very high attrition rates as such. And so that raises the question as to how much is really enough in terms of reinforcing the battle groups themselves, given that the Russian armed forces, specifically the ground forces, positioned near the Baltic countries, have suffered very high levels of attrition as they have. Of course, sending in a tank squadron of the sort that Canada has recently announced obviously adds to the firepower and maneuver capabilities of the battle group, but it might not necessarily be the necessary thing to do in view of what Russia has been undertaken by sending so much equipment and using personnel, mobilized or not, as cannon fodder in many cases. And so there's an assurance aspect to these contributions in the sense that they assure Latvia that the battle group can put up a very strong defense to such a degree that they can repel Russian forces and liberate whatever conquered territory those Russian forces might try to take or end up taking. But at the same time, the deterrence need has in fact shifted away from providing even more military forces to the Baltic countries precisely because of the level of attrition that the Russian armed forces have suffered. That being said, Russia still has been reconstituting a lot of military units. Some of them have suffered 300% casualty rates, which suggests that there's insane turnover in some of those units. Russia, as you pointed out, still engages in various war crimes along various vectors along Ukraine. Indeed, Zelensky had put out a statement today that there could be some sort of sabotage operation afoot at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So, as much as the Russian army has suffered tremendously, it is still capable of wreaking tremendous harm, such that the assurance aspect might very well be politically desirable, if not necessary, even if the military aspect may not necessarily be as strong of an argument as, say, it once was in 2021 before the Russian armed forces committed itself to that very tragic, well, ill-fated decision, as it were, to go about an invasion of Ukraine.
Very good. I'm just gonna coming towards the end here. Two questions maybe to wrap it up. One, you know, in Vilnius summit, particularly when it comes to the EFP, uh, what do you see the sort of expected announcements or developments? And it's a part of that question, do you think, someone who understands the region and follows it closely, the decisions that were taken last year in Madrid up to now, to what extent the developments meet the expectations of particularly the host nations in the region compared to what the reality has been delivered, and what do you expect in Vilnius with regards to the EFP? And as a part of that, like where are we? How did we come on this one? And is it time to start thinking about a permanent stationing as by officially terminating the NATO Russia Founding Act and permanently stationing NATO troops in the region rather than rotational basis? So those two things.
Because NATO is a consensus-based organization, you need to have the agreement of all 31, maybe now 32, members signing on to any sort of decision at the alliance level. And as such, it's really hard to go about major changes to policy, including the NATO-Russia Founding Act. The United States still pays lip service to the NATO-Russia Founding Act. It's not just Germany, although I think if the United States were to abandon its position and pressure Germany, then I think the NRFA would probably be left in the dustbin. But with respect to the EFP, I do not foresee many significant changes that would be announced. These things are oftentimes negotiated in advance of the meeting of various ministerials. Indeed, I already saw an article in the Lithuanian press that the communique is already being drafted, which tells you that, at least on the big issues, the decisions have already been made. Now, there could still be some announcement about the NATO-Russia Founding Act. I think a lot of people will be looking for a final repudiation of that document. It should have perhaps been repudiated in 2014 with the seizure of Crimea, but alas, here we are. I don't necessarily see it happening, but it should happen. There are calls, of course, for there to be a very clear membership pathway for Ukraine. But again, it's a 31 going on 32 member alliance. Some allies are very hesitant about Ukraine joining NATO. And indeed, my own view is that Ukraine will be allowed to join NATO when it no longer needs NATO. So I don't really see too much happening there. There's been some mixed messaging about the use of NATO as an alliance to provide weapons to Ukraine, but for a number of political reasons, the decision was made early on to go about multilateral discussions of weapons transfers to Ukraine outside of NATO auspices, in part to counteract potential lines of Russian propaganda and argumentation. And so decisions about upgrading the battle groups will probably echo those that were made in Madrid. I think what we're probably going to see more concretely is a call for 2% of defense spending as a share of gross domestic product being the floor. And indeed, the pledge was made uh, earlier than 2014, but became certified in 2014 at the Wales Summit. The call was, of course, for NATO members to reach that goal by 2024. We're in 2023. A number of countries fall well short of it. And so I can see this Vilnius Summit reinforcing that pledge, perhaps arguing for a timetable that might be a little more aggressive in view of what's been happening in the region since 2014.
Now, this is actually a great segue to for my last question. When it comes to the summit and expectations from Canada by the allies, uh, what do we expect the political pressure be? The 2% is definitely going to be on the table. I think we have seen a number of both leaks as well as news articles, basically expressing dissatisfaction by NATO allies that Canada doesn't seem to be in a hurry to meet that particular target, and that now that as Stoltenberg highlighted, it's not the ceiling, it's the floor, and that seems to be the direction, as you pointed out. What do you expect from the Canadian side? The Canadian government might announce or try to um, convince the allies that Canada will be stepping up, or is it too optimistic to expect the government to be pushed along these lines and would continue to say that, well, we'll get there eventually?
To be fair to the Canadian government, I never detected much dissatisfaction on the part of Latvians with respect to their leadership of the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in their country. In fact, I think it's worked out really nice for them. My colleague Tom Rostock would say that with Canada being a leader of the battle group, that makes the playing field or the discussion being much more level between the two allies than what would be the case if it were France, Germany, or even the United States. Of course, Latvian officials have argued for some sort of American presence on their soil. There's nothing that's better than having a firm American commitment to your own territory. But that being said, they have not been as dissatisfied as one might think about the quality of the Canadian military commitment. To the contrary, I think they've been fairly satisfied, even though there are, of course, very reasonable concerns about the pace of the um, effort to build up the battle group from a battalion size to a brigade size. Of course, outside of the Latvian Canadian alliance within NATO, there are other allies that do think that Canada should be stepping up, that has easy road on American involuntary security guarantees, because of course Canada is the only NATO country to have a land border with the United States. How lucky are we? And so I can see some movement on the part of Canada to go about spending more, as what we've already seen. The Trudeau government has already made those sorts of pledges. There hasn't really been much in the last budget that really signals anything new. Above all, I think um, in any sort of defense policy update, what we're going to see, it'll probably be more focus or an emphasis still on some of the basic recruitment and retention challenges that the Canadian Armed Forces are currently facing and have been facing for a while.
So, in other words, we probably will not be expecting to see any sort of major announcements in NATO summit when it comes to defense spending and similar from the Canadian side.
There could be announcements, and there have been a trickle of announcements that we have seen over the course of the last year with regards to NORAD modernization, the delivery of more weapons to Ukraine, in addition to the new Leopards or not new Leopards, but the additional deployment of Leopards to the Canadian battle group in Latvia. I don't necessarily see anything that would be a game changer. These sorts of things, again, are negotiate in advance follow a particular process, and as such, we have to manage our expectations for what would be newly announced.
Yes, and of course, where the rubber hits the road is you know uh, announcing and attaching actual amounts to those with a timetable that's quite clear, that this is what we're going to spend, this is what we're going to spend on, and this is the time frame we're going to do it, and here's the clear commitment rather than some amorphous, I think, declarations. So thank you, Alexander, for joining me today in this Inside Policy talks, and providing, I think, an excellent overview of what we can expect in the upcoming NATO summit, as well as quite a detailed take on the EFB and Canada's commitment to Latvia and the defense of our allies over there. And thank you for the audience for tuning in.